Alrighty. Okay, so my name is Kyle Whitaker. Thank you for coming to my talk. So what I've done is pre-recorded my talk. There's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that I have a 5.5-month-old who you might hear screaming in the background if I were to try to deliver it live. So I've got about an hour and 10-minute talks. If you give me an hour and 20 minutes to talk, I'm going to take the whole time. So I'm going to share my screen and play that video, but just briefly about me. I'm a recent lecturer here at UW Green Bay in philosophy. One of my specialties is the epistemology of expertise and disagreement and misinformation and that sort of thing. So the theme of this conference really hits home for me. I think about it all the time, and I'm really glad that we're doing this. So the title of my talk is Critical Thinking Won't Help Much with the Misinformation Problem. That's kind of a bleak talk. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen and play the video. So in this talk, we're going to explore critical thinking and misinformation. I've titled this Critical Thinking Won't Help Much with the Misinformation Problem, so you know my position right here from the beginning. We're not actually going to get to that specific argument until about halfway through probably. First, what I want to do is just set up what the misinformation problem is, distinguish it from some different problems that are related but not quite exactly the same, narrow my focus in on one specific kind of problem. Define some terms. What do I mean by critical thinking? What do I mean by misinformation? That sort of thing. Give you some examples of the sort of misinformation I have in mind. I'm going to be using COVID-19 misinformation mostly throughout the talk as sort of a running case study, but I'll give you some other examples as well that are the sorts of misinformation that I'm going to be dealing with here. And then we'll talk about why people believe misinformation. I'll set up for you what an epistemological account of misinformation looks like, distinguish it from some other kinds of accounts, and give kind of an epistemological take on why we're here, what's going on in the heads of people who buy into misinformation, how we got here. And then I'll close with some thoughts about what, if anything, can be done about it, and specifically, what role might the sort of modern university have to play. And kind of fit that in with what does this mean for democracy? That'll be sort of the closing thoughts here. It's going to be kind of a bleak take. I'm a philosopher. Philosophers aren't known for their optimism necessarily. So just apologies for that in advance, okay? So starting out, let's first define some terms. So what do I mean by critical thinking? Here's a standard textbook, literally pulled this out of a textbook, definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking is simply the careful application of reason and the determination of whether or not a claim is true. This is what I tell my students, and then I teach them in the course of a semester to do that. And this is one of the main jobs faculty like to think, administrators like to think of a university, is to instill critical thinking skills into their students. And as we're going to see, one of the most popular responses to what I'm calling the misinformation problem is for people to make the claim that, look, this is a problem because people aren't good critical thinkers. And if we were doing our jobs better, maybe at university, or if we, were somehow able to get more people access to a university education where they could learn these skills, the misinformation problem wouldn't be quite so dire as it is. So that's an issue that I'm going to be tackling in this talk. So that's what I mean by critical thinking. Pretty straightforward. What is misinformation? Misinformation is simply the unintentional spreading of false claims as though they were true. So I see something on social media, it seems compelling, I want other people to know about it, I don't bother investigating it or vetting it or anything like that. It's a false claim, I don't know it's a false claim, I share it on social media, that's an instance of misinformation. Disinformation, on the other hand, is the intentional spreading of false claims as though they were true. This can be something I invented myself, just made it up out of whole cloth. There are people who spend all of their time doing this. I've seen some fascinating and really scary documentaries of people who just create disinformation and spread it around the internet for whatever nefarious purposes. Russian hackers famously flooded American social media with disinformation about our recent couple elections. This is intentional. This is just deception, straightforward lying. That's disinformation. So what I'm going to be calling the misinformation problem is as follows. A great many otherwise intelligent, educated people accept and recommend for acceptance claims that are demonstrably and discernibly false. So there are various important aspects to this definition. I've italicized them here. So it's a lot of people, okay, a great many people. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a problem. It would just be misinformation. But this is like a national phenomenon, a global phenomenon. This is what makes it a problem. There's a lot of such people, millions and millions, okay? Intelligent, educated people. I'm going to focus in on that. I think that's important. There are lots and lots of people who would not fit those qualifiers, who share misinformation. But that's not, I think, the most either theoretically interesting or sort of socially pernicious aspect of the problem. And so I'm going to focus in on intelligent, educated people who accept and recommend for acceptance claims that are demonstrably false. So the information is out there. It has been demonstrated. We could easily find out that these claims are false. And they're discernibly so. So the demonstration of their falsehood is not like hidden away in some kind of academic silo somewhere. It's there to be found if someone were to put in kind of a minimal effort to find it. So this problem is not the disinformation problem. People just lying and manufacturing information for political gain or whatever. That's really bad. That's something we should be concerned about. There need to be efforts to cut that off. But that's different from the misinformation problem that I want to focus on here. So I'm specifically interested in the spreading of false information among the, again, intelligent and relatively educated. I'm going to call these people the intellectually capable, okay? So studies have shown, and we're going to look at some of them, that the more educated you are tend to be the less susceptible to misinformation you are, to accepting it or to spreading it to others. And so there is definitely this inverse correlation between educational attainment and probably cognitive ability and accepting and spreading misinformation. But, as we will see, there is a scary number of people who are intellectually capable. They're relatively of average intelligence or above, and they have at least a 4-year college degree, if not higher than that, and still are susceptible to misinformation, a very large number of people, and that's what I want to focus on here. A couple reasons for focusing on the intellectually capable. One, just a theoretical reason, the problem of misinformation among the intellectually incapable, while really bad and while we should be definitely trying to do something about it, it's more easily explainable. Just at a theoretical level, it's not really that difficult to understand why somebody who lacked education or cognitive ability would accept specious claims and spread them around the internet. It's more interesting why someone who ought to know better would do such a thing. And then also there's a practical reason here, and that's for the purposes of democracy, right, which is one of the themes of this conference. The proportion of educated people who are susceptible to misinformation is actually large enough to shift things significantly politically towards evidence-based governance if those people could be reached. And it seems like it might be a more manageable task, at least in the short term, to reach them than it would be to sort of educate the intellectually incapable, okay? So just a couple reasons for focusing on what I'm calling the intellectually capable. What are some examples of the misinformation problem as I'm defining it here? Well, there are many. We don't have to look far to find good examples. So we've got the famous Stop the Steal movement, right? This idea that the last election was stolen from Donald Trump and handed to President Biden, as you know, that the result of some kind of elite cabal of powerful people who somehow were able to take over the ballot boxes and manufacture votes and surreptitiously give them to Biden and then cover up every investigation into it so that the evidence seemed like none of that happened when in fact it did. We can go as far down that rabbit hole as we want. That's demonstrably false, discernibly so, and a great many people believe it, and a great many of those people are otherwise intelligent and educated. Pizzagate. So this is the famous QAnon conspiracy theory, where a lot of people, a shocking number of people, conservative Americans mostly, came to believe that there was, again, this conspiratorial elite group of people, Democrats, leaders in the Democratic Party, the Clintons among them, of course, who, believe it or not, were running some kind of child sex trafficking ring and using this little pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. as a front for doing so. that's a thing that happened, and a lot of people believed it. Climate change denial, a much more pervasive one than that. Lots of people either deny that the Earth is currently warming, despite all of the decades of scientific research into that question, or they admit that it's warming and they deny that it's caused by humans, again, despite decades of research into that. And then, of course, there's COVID-19, and there's all sorts of misinformation around COVID-19, and that's the one I'm going to be focusing the most on as a sort of running case study for this talk. So let me give you some examples of COVID-19 misinformation. And I've drawn these examples very intentionally from my own experience. I could have picked the most off-the-wall ones I could think of, but I didn't. Here are things that people I know or am acquainted with personally believe or have believed at some point about COVID-19. That it's not important to get vaccinated unless you're old or immunocompromised. That the numbers of COVID deaths have been artificially inflated. For example, that people who die of other causes were, ascribed to a COVID death for whatever reason. That various over-the-counter remedies are more effective at treating or curing COVID than the vaccine is. That the vaccine was rushed and is therefore untrustworthy. That the vaccine's side effects are riskier or worse than COVID itself. That breakthrough COVID cases and or variants of COVID negate the usefulness of the vaccine. I just heard somebody in a bar the other day saying this to somebody else. That so-called natural immunity, that is just getting COVID, is as good as or better than the vaccines are. And that vaccine mandates are unprecedented in American history, when in fact, of course, they're not. So it's just a list of things off the top of my head that people that I personally know believe about COVID-19. Now, what's happening here? It's very common to just sort of as a knee-jerk reaction when you encounter stuff like this, to assume that people who believe that must either just be dumb or uneducated. And I'm going to try to convince you that that's not the case. So anecdotally, just from my own experience, I don't believe that's the case because all of the people I just referenced as believing that list of things I just gave you, all of them are educated with at least a 4-year degree. At least one of them I can think of has a PhD in a scientific field. At least 2 of them I can think of off the top of my head work in healthcare. They're all educated. They're all intelligent. And they believe these things and then pass these claims on to others. They've passed them on to me. So there's some anecdotal evidence that what we're dealing with here is more than just stupidity or lack of education. But empirically, there's evidence for this as well. Now, we should say, again, just affirm here that there is definitely a real statistically significant correlation between misinformation susceptibility and level of education. Many studies have borne this out. Here's just a real quick list that I picked from amongst a much longer amount of data that's out there. A 2015 study states that lower levels of education have been found to be associated with higher conspiracy belief. For the purposes of this talk, when I reference a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory, we're going to treat that as just an instance, a kind of misinformation. Lots of other studies have confirmed the same thing. A 2016 study says that people with high education are less likely than people with low education to believe in conspiracy theories, and several other examples here as well. If you're watching this and you want a copy of this PowerPoint, just email me and I'll make that available to you so you can click these links and follow them if you want to. Just use my UW Green Bay email, that is whitaker@uwgb.edu. So lots of studies have confirmed this. I won't go through all of them here. But there is also a sometimes overlooked and troublingly large mass of people who are educated, like my friends, and nonetheless accept and spread misinformation. So, for example, a 2016 study found that most Stanford University students, most of them, couldn't identify the difference between a mainstream source and a fringe source. A Pew survey from last year found that, quote, educational attainment is an especially important factor when it comes to perceptions of the conspiracy theory that COVID-19 was planned. This is the specific conspiracy theory or piece of misinformation that they asked people about in this survey. How strongly do you believe that COVID-19 was planned? It was intentional. Around half of Americans with a high school diploma or less, 48%, thought that conspiracy theory was probably or definitely true. 38% of those with some college, but no degree, believed it was probably or definitely true. Here's what I want you to focus on, though. 24% of people with a bachelor's degree and 15% of people with a postgraduate degree agreed that that obviously false conspiracy theory that COVID-19 was planned, that you could investigate and in 5 minutes debunk if you tried. 24% of people with a bachelor's and 15% with more than a bachelor's thought that that was probably or definitely true. This year, another survey, an American Perspective survey, found that in response to the statement, Donald Trump has been secretly fighting a group of child sex traffickers led by prominent Democrats and Hollywood elites, okay? That's the QAnon Pizzagate thing I mentioned a moment ago. Even more extreme than the kind of COVID misinformation we were just talking about. What that survey found was that 19% of college-educated Republicans, so we're focused here on Republicans for the moment, 19% of them with a college degree rated that claim either completely or mostly accurate, and a full 35% of them were unsure. I'm going to let that settle in for just a second. What that means is 54% or most Republicans surveyed did not recognize that claim as inaccurate. For non-college educated Republicans, the numbers were, as you would expect, worse. 34% either completely or mostly thought that was accurate. 47% were unsure. An overwhelming majority of uneducated college or non-college educated Republicans were unable to recognize that statement as inaccurate. When you look at other claims, like, for example, that Antifa was responsible for the attack on the Capitol in January, or that there's this kind of deep state, right, conspiracy going on, working to undermine the Trump administration, the numbers for those claims are just even worse. And in fact, for that latter one, the deep state conspiracy theory, the numbers for the educated and the uneducated are actually quite similar, barely statistically different. So again, feel free to follow that link for that really depressing data if you would like to. So in addition to that empirical data I just pointed to, we can also see that misinformation is just too widespread a problem to be explained solely by stupidity or lack of education. That same Pew survey I referenced a moment ago found that a full quarter of U.S. adults see at least some truth to the conspiracy theory that COVID-19 was planned. Another study from last year states that notable segments in all countries surveyed find misinformation reliable. For example, in Spain, about 37.5% of the population in this representative Spanish poll rated misinformation about the COVID-19 virus as at least somewhat reliable. You find comparable estimates in the UK and the USA. This is not just us. This is a global phenomenon. The more of these studies you look at, you see usually anywhere from a quarter to a third or even sometimes higher of the populations in most countries surveyed accept some version of widespread misinformation. So obviously this sort of thing causes direct harm. In the Pizzagate thing, a guy walks into Comet Ping Pong, which is his pizza parlor, with a gun and fires it, looking for what he thinks is a child sex trafficking ring. He goes to the back, he finds a door that he's sure is going to lead him into a dungeon, opens it to find a supply closet, and is immediately arrested. Okay? That could have gone much, much worse than it did, and it was already bad enough. There have been many documented cases of overdoses of things like chloroquine or ivermectin. Some people have died. Lots of people have been hospitalized. Let me give you an example of one of those here. This is something I personally saw on social media. So this is somebody, I don't know who, in some Facebook group somewhere, that is giving a very confident and very specific instruction set for how to take ivermectin to treat COVID-19. The scariest part of this for me is this right here, if you can see that. he recommends this person taking your body weight, multiplying it by 2, and says, that's your horse weight. Because, of course, the ivermectin that you can get most easily is intended for horses. And so how do you know how much to take? Well, you just multiply your body weight by 2. This would be hilarious if not so scary and so dangerous. And there are, again, documented cases of people overdosing on ivermectin and dying or being hospitalized. There was the famous attacks on 5G towers in the UK because of this conspiracy theory that somehow 5G cellular technology is related to or causing COVID-19. I didn't realize this until looking more deeply into it, but it wasn't just the towers that were attacked. There were also engineers putting up the towers who were accosted, one of them hospitalized, I believe. There were the Iranian methanol poisonings. Literally thousands of people hospitalized. I think something like 700 died from ingesting toxic methanol because of a conspiracy theory, some misinformation swirling online that it would cure COVID-19. There are many others. This is just a sort of fraction of the harms that have been caused by misinformation. Here's a study, if you want to look at it, that documents hundreds of deaths and thousands of hospitalizations around the world associated with COVID-19 misinformation. So, what's going on here? Why do people believe this kind of thing? Otherwise intelligent, educated people. So we can approach a question like that in several ways. So I'll just give you some examples of how it might be approached. Psychologists look into this question all the time, and they have a lot of really fascinating things to say. And they tend to examine the question from the perspective of, what drives are giving rise to certain kinds of biases that would lead people to be more susceptible to this kind of information. So, for example, the need to be in the know, right? Or the need to feel smart, or to feel informed, or to feel unique, to kind of stand out as somebody that's especially capable. Or the need to feel in control and safe. The more I know, the more in control I feel, like I can do something about this. Or maybe the desire to be part of a powerful group. That's important too, especially if I can balance it with also simultaneously feeling unique and like I don't just blend in. So psychologists look into all these drives and give us some really interesting explanations for why people would be susceptible to this kind of thing. Sociologists might describe the role of cultural and social structures that could help explain the acceptance of misinformation, such as, for example, historic marginalization among certain groups of people, like African Americans, that would lead them to be more susceptible to certain kinds of misinformation, but for like good historical reasons, because of past or current oppression. In groups like that, also groups of people in Muslim countries, you don't always find this correlation, actually, between susceptibility to misinformation and education level. And there are some interesting sociological reasons for that. We could give a political analysis of misinformation. There we would be exploring how the struggle for power or partisan polarization might affect your reasoning habits and your willingness to accept and spread misinformation. Some really interesting work has been done on that, not always revealing what you might expect. The story there is actually quite complicated. But I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a political scientist, I'm an epistemologist, and I dabble in ethics. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to take an epistemological look at this problem and then also an ethical look. And so what an epistemological take on the misinformation problem does is it theorizes about how knowledge is achieved or prevented under non-ideal social conditions. This is called social epistemology. Such as, for example, echo chambers, we're going to talk about those, misinformation-rich environments, basically being on Facebook, in other words, and we examine the justification structures and the normative status of beliefs that are formed in those environments. So we're going to do some of that. We're also going to take an ethical look, and that's going to investigate the weaknesses of character or moral norm violations that are significant for explaining the misinformation problem. And I actually think that all of these strands of evidence, all these different kinds of methodological approaches are really important and should be combined in a robust interdisciplinary effort to understand and deal with misinformation. We need all of them, which is why I'm so glad to see so many different kinds of inquiry represented in this conference. But I'm going to focus on these two, epistemology and ethics. So here's an epistemological account of the misinformation problem. We're going to be trying to understand, why do people believe false things in mass? And again, specifically, why do intellectually capable people believe false things in mass? So first, we're going to ask, what's going on in these people's heads? In other words, how are their beliefs working? Second, how did we get here? What's the causal story here? Why are these people accepting these false claims? And then 3, what, if anything, can be done about this? What kind of solutions might there be? So what's going on? There's lots of suggestions, easy suggestions for what's going on here that have been offered. And I'm going to say that most of them are unhelpful. So let's go through some of these. Are these people stupid? Well, we've already seen evidence to suggest the contrary. I think it's very unlikely that most of these people are stupid. As we've seen, many of them have degrees, sometimes advanced degrees. Many of them work in professional fields that are difficult, that require a lot of cognitive ability and education. These are not stupid people, and if that's your sort of hand-wavy, offhand response, I'm going to encourage you to reflect on that and just look at the evidence. That doesn't seem to be the case. Are these people just bad thinkers, right? Because you don't have to be stupid to be poor at critical thinking. So maybe that's what's going on. I think that's possible, and I think in many cases, when you accept an instance of misinformation and then share it with others, you're definitely usually not thinking very carefully. But I don't think this can be the whole story, and we're going to see some reasons for that. I think just jumping directly to that is going to miss some important nuance in this conversation. It's also worth pointing out that you can be a good thinker and still susceptible to misinformation, because even good thinkers have bad days, right? Even good thinkers get tired sometimes, don't always do their due diligence or whatever. And even though this isn't the problem that we're specifically focused on here, you'd still be susceptible to disinformation even as a really good thinker. You could be in basically ideal epistemic conditions, and a really clever, technologically savvy disinformation peddler could fool you, okay? It's not the problem we're focused on, but it's worth keeping in mind. What about this? Maybe everybody who accepts or shares misinformation is just irrational, okay? So they don't have to be stupid. They don't have to be a bad thinker. They could have some basic critical thinking skills, but they're behaving irrationally for one reason or another when they do this. You might think that that's obviously true, right? If you accept one of those examples of misinformation I gave earlier, many of which to this audience probably seem just obviously irrational, right? I don't care what your background is. If you accept and spread that claim, you're acting irrationally. I'm going to call this into question. I'm going to say this is not necessarily the case, okay? And I'm going to draw a distinction here to help make this clear between internal rationality and external rationality. So I'm drawing this from the epistemology literature. Internal rationality is an epistemically appropriate response to a person's mental states. So given the mental states that I possess, given the kinds of evidence I have access to via those mental states, given my past experiences, given the social context I live in, given the sources of information that I trust and give credence to, I react appropriately to my mental states. That's internal rationality. External rationality is probably what most of us have in mind when we say things like the COVID-19 conspiracy theory that, it was intentionally invented in a lab somewhere and then spread to the world for political purposes. That's clearly irrational. We tend to think of external rationality, and that is when a person's cognitive processing mechanisms are working as they should to produce beliefs that tend toward truth and are typically justified, something like that. I'm going to say that's not the most helpful version of rationality to focus on when we're talking about why people believe misinformation. It won't help us to understand where they're coming from as much as internal rationality will. And I'm going to suggest that many, perhaps not all, of course, and not all the time, but many people, particularly cognitively capable people who have some education, who accept and spread misinformation, are doing so in an internally rational way, given the information that they possess. One reason to think that these people are acting at least internally rationally is that it's just hard to know which experts to trust, And it can be harder depending on your kind of social and epistemic situation. So it's hard for me, for example, someone who is highly educated and actively studies how evidence is processed and understood across domains. It's very difficult for me to tell the difference between, let's say, a true expert in like organic chemistry and someone who knows just enough about organic chemistry to appear to be an expert, okay? Because I know almost nothing about organic chemistry. It's difficult for me to know which experts to trust about that. And I know that it would be very difficult for someone who knew nothing about epistemology to figure out who the real expert epistemologists were, as opposed to the people just peddling information online, but making a good show of it and claiming to be epistemologists, assuming there are such people. So figuring out who to trust is hard, especially if you've grown up in an environment where you've been presented with clear authorities and you haven't been given any good reason to distrust those authorities. And those authorities could have been giving you false information the whole time, but what reason would you have in that situation to leave that, to incur the costs of leaving that situation, to find different authorities? You need a really good reason to do that. There's also such thing as a cognitive island, and I'm drawing this phrase from a philosopher named T. Nguyen, who says you can be in a situation, maybe that organic chemistry example is a version of this, you can be in a situation where you need to be an expert yourself to determine who the experts are. He calls those cognitive islands. And if you find yourself in a situation like that, then it's just very, very difficult to know who to trust. And so you can fail to trust the right experts and therefore fail to believe true information and believe misinformation instead through kind of no fault of your own. You can do that in an internally rational way. Another version of this, another reason why you can believe misinformation rationally, is if you've ever only known one epistemic authority, it makes sense to continue trusting that authority until you have really, really good reason not to, especially if excavating your belief system is enormously costly, which for a lot of people it is. To disbelieve that there is a deep state conspiracy within the Democratic Party would be a very costly, socially, mentally, emotionally, perhaps financially costly thing for a lot of Americans to do. And if that belief system is mostly working for you, and if giving up that belief system means basically starting from scratch and probably losing friends and family members and possibly financial support, it can be, I want to say, internally rational to resist that unless, again, you have a really, really overridingly good reason. So the lesson I think we should draw here is that people who accept and share misinformation, intellectually capable people, are probably behaving as you would likely behave if you were in their epistemic context. Okay? So writing them all off as irrational, I think, is unhelpful for understanding the issue or for dealing with the problem. So how did we get here? What do we think the better analysis of the situation is? I'm going to give you some options here. We can say, A, these people who accept misinformation and spread it to others, they just don't care about truth. That's one popular explanation. B, these people must all be dumb or just incapable of critical thought. That's another popular explanation. Or C, my preferred explanation, these people are acting rationally, again, internally so, given the information that they possess. And it's very important which of these explanations we default to, because it will determine what we think the candidates for an appropriate response to the misinformation problem would be. That depends on what we think has gone wrong. So, for example, if I believe A, then I'm probably going to try to get that person to care about truth. That's probably not going to work, and so I'm going to give up, most likely, when that fails. And then I'm going to view them as an adversary, as a problem that needs to be corrected, and probably without their involvement, because they just don't care about truth. They've checked out of the project for finding truth, according to my view. And of course, treating them that way is just going to reinforce the polarization and ultimately augment the problem. If I believe B, I might opine on the importance of education. I might try to teach them some critical thinking skills. They're probably going to view that as condescending. It's probably not going to go well. Might actually make them feel humiliated. I might then lean into that because I've decided, well, you're incapable of critical thought, or you're just dumb, or whatever, and here you are spreading misinformation. So it's important that other people recognize that you're dumb or incapable of critical thought. So I might actually actively try to humiliate that person publicly. I've witnessed this on social media a lot. And again, probably not a very effective way of dealing with the problem, certainly not an effective way of reaching that person or engaging with them. If I actually want to engage with them, maybe have a dialogue, seems like C is the best option. Now, I'm not arguing here that you should want to have a dialogue, okay, that everyone needs to find somebody who is susceptible to misinformation and start dialoguing with them. That's not my claim. But if you think dialogue is important, if you think that's an important part of moving forward on the misinformation problem, admitting the internal rationality of these people, I think is going to be required. So, what about this claim that they just don't care about truth? Well, look, apparently they care a lot. I don't know if you've actually tried to talk to people spreading these claims online, ask them how important they think it is that you understand what they're saying, why vaccines are dangerous or whatever. They care a lot. They haven't given up on truth at all. They think it's really important that you believe what they believe. It's also not true that they're just uninformed. Many of these people are hyper-informed. They're doing far more work than me or probably anybody else I know at tracking down information. Now, of course, they're usually finding information that supports their view, but they're doing some investigating, right? So the problem isn't that they don't care about truth or that they're uninformed. They trust a different set of authorities than most of the rest of us. That's the issue. It could be that they're also underprepared to encounter misinformation and so don't process it well. It could be that they're structurally disadvantaged. For example, in the African American case, there are good structural reasons to distrust legitimate experts. Okay, so that could be part of the problem as well. And they could be duped. They could just be fooled, hoodwinked. It can happen to smart, educated people, no question about it. But we're still left with the question here, what could cause such large numbers of smart, educated people who clearly desperately want to be informed? What could cause them to be so sincerely and thoroughly confused? And here I think there's a particular concept that will help our understanding, and that is echo chambers. Echo chambers are the subject of lots of conversation in epistemology recently. I think that's a very good thing. One philosopher from Utah in particular, T. Nguyen, has described echo chambers and distinguished them from what he calls epistemic bubbles. So epistemic bubbles he defines as situations where a person is exposed only to one kind of information, that is information that aligns with what they already believe. So I just never encounter information outside of my bubble, and so I'm just not aware of it. And I assume everybody agrees with me because everybody I come into contact with agrees with me. That's an epistemic bubble. An echo chamber is different. An echo chamber is a situation where one actively distrusts all but one source of information, or all sources of information that don't align with that person's pre-existing views. So it's not that I'm not encountering other sources of information. It's not that I'm not encountering views that disagree with mine. I might even be seeking them out. I might be very aware of them, more aware than most people. It's that I actively distrust the sources of information that disagree with me. So he says an epistemic bubble is when you don't hear people from the other side. An echo chamber is what happens when you don't trust people from the other side. By the way, that Eon article is a must read for anybody watching this. So bubbles, epistemic bubbles, obviously bad. They're dangerous because they limit the scope of information that you have access to. They lead to overconfidence. But fortunately, they're relatively easily fixed. You can pop an epistemic bubble by simply injecting more information into that person's point of view. Okay? And I've done this. I've had conversations where that worked out, assuming the other person was engaging in good faith. Okay? Echo chambers are not so easily fixed. Access to information isn't the problem, and therefore more information won't fix the problem. Ironically, we could say an echo chamber immunizes you against contrary evidence, right? So if you confront someone in an echo chamber, you try to argue with them, might actually make the situation worse. A couple reasons for that. It can confirm whatever their authority told them to expect about you, So Nguyen calls this intellectual judo. It's like using the force of your opponent against them, right? That happens a lot because echo chamber authorities prime you to expect certain things of the outside that they know you're likely to encounter. And so when you encounter it, it ends up disconfirming whatever the outside view is saying and confirming what your authority told you. Another reason that this can make things worse is because by confronting people in echo chambers, you can actually increase what some psychologists have called the fluency of misinformation. Fluency is the ease of information recall. So there's quite a bit of empirical data to suggest that the more you encounter something, the more fluid it becomes, or fluent it becomes, the more easily you recall it, and the easier you find it is to believe it. So one study from Cambridge said, attempting to quash rumors through direct refutation may actually facilitate their diffusion by increasing fluency or ease of recall. The empirical results find that merely repeating a rumor increases its power. So we got to be careful when we're confronting people that we think might be in echo chambers, because echo chambers are kind of like cults. I mean, the structural epistemic similarity is remarkable here. People have their own authority structures, sometimes their own social institutions, maybe their own universities even, or schools that they call universities. They have their own set of experts who they believe alone are trustworthy. They think all mainstream authorities and institutions and experts are malicious or deceptive or incompetent or out to get them or whatever. Echo chambers, like cults, prey on people's vulnerability. We need each other to know what's going on. We're epistemically vulnerable. We have to rely on each other to understand something as huge as COVID-19 and what we should do about it. Echo chamber authorities know that, and they prey on it. And then they react to questioning of any central dogma with hostility, contempt, marginalization, shunning, kicking you out, whatever. Now note that any institution, a religious group, a political group, a Facebook group, a fandom, a workplace, any institution can become an echo chamber, so long as there's a shared set of authorities, values, or dogmas. So echo chambers, I think, as a concept, help us to explain why option C that I gave you a moment ago, that people who accept and disseminate misinformation are most likely internally rational, help us to understand why that's the best explanation for such widespread misinformation and false belief. Because people in echo chambers care deeply about the truth. They just trust radically different sources of information. They're not dumb. Lots of very smart, educated people have succumbed to cult or echo chamber influence. I would probably say that at a certain point in my life, maybe a little over a decade ago, I was probably in a kind of echo chamber, actually. And it took graduate school in a completely different city with a completely different set of people to get me out of it. And people in echo chambers are not necessarily epistemically compromised. They could be acting internally rationally. They could be on a cognitive island. Nguyen calls that a runaway echo chamber, when you're in a situation where, in order to recognize who the experts are, you have to yourself be one, okay? So that could be the case as well. So it might not be any fault of their own that they're in this epistemic position. So Nguyen says in an article called Cognitive Islands, under these cognitively isolated circumstances, we can simply be trapped despite our best efforts. So flaws in our beliefs and cognitive abilities will reinforce themselves by influencing our selection of which experts to trust. This is not necessarily the outcome of epistemic laziness or maliciousness. These sorts of runaway echo chambers turn out to be a basic feature of human cognitive life. So summing up, the right thing to do, if outside sources are untrustworthy, or if you can't tell who the experts are, is to distrust them. Okay? So what is to be done about this? What can we do about this? Well, a clue for what might be done about this, and I'm drawing this from Nguyen as well, is that to notice that a common way that echo chambers are formed is that whatever your authority is in the chamber is the one you encountered first. It's your parents, or it's the church you went to first, or whatever. And so if you can notice that it's irrational to trust a source more than any other source just because it happened to be the first one you encountered, right? If you notice, for example, that if you'd been born in a different country, you'd probably have a different religious outlook. You'd probably have different opinions about politics and lots of other social issues. If you can notice that, that might be a little bit of a wedge into an echo chamber. So that could be progress. Another wedge might be that recognizing that people on the outside of the chamber are not as bad as you thought. Not as bad as the echo chamber authority told you they were going to be. So if you look at stories of people escaping from cults or other kinds of echo chambers, most often those experiences turn on specific encounters with people from the outside that didn't fit the prescribed narrative. They turned out to be kind and engaging and, wanted to understand you. And so, when they didn't turn out to be hostile jerks, that opened a crack in the echo chamber, and then the person was open to questioning other aspects of the echo chamber authority as well. Now, so this might suggest a strategy of, let's call it friendship. And some philosophers have argued for this. So there was recently, this year, a volume published on the epistemology of fake news, and someone at the end of that volume suggests this kind of strategy, befriending people in echo chambers to open that crack in their worldview. Unfortunately, hate to be Debbie Downer here, but this is not a scalable solution. Leaving echo chambers in this way depends on someone else's patience and determination, and is therefore quite rare, and doesn't always work when you attempt it. Most people in echo chambers go their whole lives without leaving them, because they never have the right kind of encounter, or that encounter is never successful to give them the motivation to leave, because leaving is usually very costly. This solution is not well suited for establishing public trust in institutions either, rather than in individuals, and it's just frankly too slow for the urgent social issues that we're confronted with that are negatively impacted by misinformation, like, for example, getting as many people vaccinated as possible, or curbing climate change, or fill in the blank. Now, Nguyen has his own suggestion for what we can do about this. It's kind of radical. He calls it the Cartesian epistemic reboot. And that word Cartesian probably clues you into what he's talking about here. He thinks if you can come to see that it's irrational to trust the first source of information you encounter, and you're not in a position to choose a better one because you only know the one, then what you can do is kind of treat yourself like a computer and just reboot, which means don't prefer any information source. Continue to accept information from the one you grew up with, but don't privilege it. Accept information from any other, and then sort of let them play it out and let the best one win. Start over. That's what he recommends. Unfortunately, while this is a nice idea, I think it suffers from many of the same issues that we just mentioned, as well as concerns about doxastic voluntarism. In other words, your ability to actually choose your own beliefs and which sources of information you trust. Many people might not be in that epistemic situation that they can actually choose just voluntarily to change their beliefs in that way. So I'm not convinced by that personally. A more popular, probably the most popular suggestion for what we can do about the misinformation problem, and it's the one that I've titled my talk after, is this: develop better critical thinking skills. Let's teach people to think well. Probably we're going to have to get them at a young age, but if we've already missed that window, it's never too late to try, right? Because if people are primed to think critically, then when they encounter misinformation, they're going to kind of have a filter. And I'll be honest with you, I teach this to my students. I teach them critical thinking, and I tell them on day one of Intro to Philosophy or whatever I'm teaching, that look, if you take this course seriously, it's going to give you a superpower. It's going to give you, I call it a bullshit detector, okay? It's going to enable you to see through bullshit. People are going to try to lead you astray. They're going to tell you stupid things, and you're going to see through it because you will have learned to analyze claims critically. So why isn't that the solution? Well, I think there are several issues with this suggestion. First, it doesn't fit the nature of the problem. Because again, the nature of the problem, what I'm calling the misinformation problem, which again is the tendency of educated, intelligent people to accept and spread misinformation. these people already have some critical thinking skills. The problem isn't that they're not skilled at critical thinking. They've never learned any of that. The problem is that they live in an echo chamber more often than not. This is too slow, again, to deal with things like climate change or COVID-19 or saving democracy or whatever. Learning to be a good critical thinker takes years. Okay, now you can learn the basics in a semester, I suppose, but to actually become, really acclimated to it, to get good facilitation with applying it in lots of different kinds of contexts, it takes a long time of dedicated effort. And that's just not feasible to deal with these urgent issues. And it's not guaranteed to work. I don't like to, again, be Debbie Downer here, but there are lots of people who don't have the aptitude to critical thinking, let's say, or don't have the willingness to put in the work to become good at it. Even if we were successful at teaching it more widely, it wouldn't fix disinformation. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. Not our focus, but we should keep that in mind, because a good disinformation artist can make things look really legit. Okay, especially if they're well funded, like Russian hackers or something. This suggestion, develop better critical thinking, it assumes that people can tell, maybe this is its biggest problem, assumes people can tell which authorities to trust in the first place. So if I'm going to learn to think critically, I'm going to learn it from somebody, okay? And I'm going to learn it with examples. The best way to learn to think critically is to engage examples of bad thinking. And somebody's going to present those to me as examples of bad thinking and contrast them with examples of good thinking. Who am I going to go to learn that from? If I pick a set of authorities to trust to teach me that, well, I've already picked a set of authorities, haven't I? And so if I'm in an echo chambered context, the suggestion to develop better critical thinking is not going to help me, because the people teaching it to me are just going to give me their particular version of critical thinking, and it's going to seem obvious to me. There's also such a thing as misinformation overload. I feel like getting on Facebook or Twitter these days is somewhat like drinking from a fire hose of misinformation. It's just coming at you example after example, and they're always such novel and creative examples of misinformation, claims that you would never think anyone would make until you encounter them. And then, of course, if you were going to research each one, it would take your whole day, okay? I'm going to call that misinformation overload. Critical thinking in a misinformation-rich environment can be too practically costly to engage in. So I could say, look, here's all these fact-checking websites. Go look at one of them. But they can't keep up. I could say, here are some strategies for Googling carefully, and here's how to recognize when a source on the internet is reliable or not. But they can't keep up either. And again, there's so many, it's so easy to make a website that looks and seems legit and to sound confident and like you have expertise when you don't. It's just, there's too much coming in for even a skilled critical thinker to keep up with it all the time. And so for all of these reasons collectively, I'm just not convinced that critical thinking is going to be the solution to our problem, because even a skilled critical thinker might learn to sense when content is suspicious, but actually confirming that it is just so much work. There's another solution that comes from psychology called pre-bunking, and there have been some interesting empirical results with this. So for one of these studies that talks about it, says, like a vaccine, we expose people to a small dose of misinformation and then explain to them how they might be misled by it, and then if they then encounter it later, it no longer sticks, okay? So they call that pre-bunking. But even in the studies where they talk about this, they note some problems with it, some drawbacks. So they say initial results may be promising, but researchers haven't yet tested the interventions on more skeptical groups of people, such as people who intentionally spread disinformation. But you wouldn't even have to be a disinformation peddler to count as a more skeptical group of people. As we've seen, you just need to exist in an echo chamber. What's most needed, they say, is research that shows whether media literacy efforts are effective outside the context in which they're taught. Just because people know how to fact check, in kind of a artificially set up condition doesn't guarantee that they'll actually do it when they encounter it. Okay, so I think while effective in some limited context, this pre-bunking thing probably ultimately falls prey to many of the same issues I just raised against the critical thinking strategy. So where does this leave us? Okay. The problem is not, in my view, that people are unwilling to trust authorities. The problem is not that people have given up on knowledge or truth. In fact, there's an abundance of trust being displayed in misinformation trends, and the people involved appear to desperately want the truth. So the average conspiracy theorist can no more explain the deep state to me or Q or what precisely is going wrong with the Pfizer vaccine than the average normal person can explain Einsteinian relativity. Okay? In both cases, we kind of just accept what we're told. All right, now you have a few nerds in both situations that really do a deep dive and can give you all the information, but the broad swath of people who accept it on authority. So that's not the problem. The problem is a preference for fringe authorities who appear to buck the system, which raises another question for me. Why would a person who is otherwise intelligent and educated prefer a fringe authority who appears to buck the system over what they would recognize to be a mainstream authority? So when I think about people in my own life who accept COVID misinformation instead of the mainstream source, and I think about how smart they are and how intelligent they are, it leads me to wonder why they choose the one over the other. So I think that in addition to the epistemic issues here, there are some moral issues, perhaps uncomfortable moral issues, that we need to consider. Okay, so let's talk about some of those ethical issues. So while blameless, internally rational acceptance of misinformation is possible, okay, it's unclear, I think, how widespread it is. And it's likely that in many cases, acceptance and spread of misinformation is, in fact, epistemically and morally blameworthy. Okay, so I just tried to convince you that you could be epistemically blameless and believe in accept and spread misinformation. Now I'm going to say you can also be blameful, okay, blameworthy, and not just epistemically so, but morally so. And then I'm going to reflect on what both of these points have to do with what we can do about it, especially in universities. So some studies suggest that people could reduce their susceptibility to misinformation if they wanted to. They just don't. Okay, so here's an article that says, we found that deliberation corrected intuitive mistakes. This is a psychological article. In contrast, political polarization was equivalent across responses. So just stopping to deliberate about something, just pausing and thinking, do I think this is a good source? Do I think this is true? Increases people's effectiveness at resisting misinformation. So they say, our data suggests that in the context of fake news, deliberation facilitates accurate belief formation and not partisan bias. So that choice to just stop and think about it for a second, which is totally within your voluntary control to do. Another study called Lazy Not Biased says, analytic thinking is used to assess the plausibility of headlines, regardless of whether the stories are consistent or inconsistent with one's political ideology, which is very interesting. People on all sides of political polarization are able to do this if they choose to. So they say, our findings therefore suggest that susceptibility to fake news is driven more by lazy thinking than it is by partisan bias per se. Another article says that individuals less willing to engage effortful, deliberative, and reflective cognitive processes, less willing to, were more likely to believe the pandemic was a hoax and less likely to have recently engaged in social distancing or hand washing. Willingness, that's the key, okay? So the mass of people that believe misinformation, including all the ones that I know and referenced earlier, are culpable, I think, for what they don't know. The information that would correct their mistaken impressions is readily available to them with minimal effort. And the choice to pursue and trust non-mainstream information sources or authorities based on flawed reasoning processes is a moral decision that must be motivated by something over which they have voluntary control, because they're able to use correct reasoning in other areas of their life. For example, in their careers, presumably. Many of them have difficult professional careers, and they're able to reason correctly there. And they seem to only lose that ability when using it would somehow risk their sense of self-confidence or identity or one of those other psychological reasons. And this sort of habitual selective justification, I'm going to say, is plainly immoral when it's applied in other areas where more direct harm or norm violation is involved. So since there is both harm and norm violation involved in the misinformation case as well, I want to say this should be considered a moral defect in addition to an epistemic one. So what's lacking is not always good epistemic habits or capacities, but rather the willingness to apply them when doing so is perceived to be costly. Or you might say what's lacking isn't ability, but character. An uncomfortable claim, but a true one, I think. So consider what the answer to the following sort of question could be for an intellectually capable person who has accepted and or shared misinformation. A question like this: why did you decide to trust that one book or blog or video or forum or whatever, rather than what you knew to be the mainstream view? And remember that most people in echo chambers are not ignorant of what the mainstream view is. That's what distinguishes chambers from bubbles. So any answer that a person gives that appeals to evidence reduces to either culpable ignorance or pretense, again, assuming we're dealing with a person of average intelligence and education. And really, those amount to the same thing here, culpable ignorance and pretense, because not pursuing further evidence that you're aware must exist and then using your ignorance as justification for that when confronted is a kind of pretense, okay? So if their answer can't be based on evidence, because the available evidence clearly points in one direction rather than another, and if evidence is easily available, which it is in all of these cases I've mentioned, then it's a choice to avoid it. And they must know that there's some reason to be found if they looked for it, because they know it's the mainstream view, and they know, if they introspect, that they don't know why it's the mainstream view, okay? But they know that it is. And so the choice to avoid this evidence that they know must be out there is presumably for some kind of personal gain. What is that personal gain? Well, that's a question for the psychologists. It could be merely hedonic or convenient or whatever. I get this kind of surge of warm feelings when people like and share my comments on Facebook or something. Whatever. Choosing to avoid evidence that could save others or to spread information that could harm others for the sake of personal gain, whatever that gain is immoral. So I'm going to give you some analogies here. Here are some obviously moral analogies that I just completely made up, okay, to just kind of drive the point home. So I'll call this first one the choker case. So someone who is competing for a job you want is choking in front of you. You're on the phone with a friend who is a doctor, and instead of asking your friend what you should do, let's assume that you don't know about the Heimlich maneuver. Instead of asking your doctor friend what you should do, you do nothing. And later tell the paramedics that you didn't know the Heimlich maneuver. Clearly wrong. Another case, we'll call this one the dangerous toy case. You're an employee at a toy company that makes a toy that has injured several children. Various child health authorities have called for the toy's recall. You have inspected and played with the toy yourself, and it seems fine to you, but you know that you're not an expert, and you know that many experts disagree with you, and you know that many children have in fact been hurt playing with the toy. A friend that trusts your judgment and is likely to take your advice asks you if the toy is safe for their child who wants one, and you tell them it's fine. The child health authorities who are wanting its recall are just trying to get publicity. They're just trying to discredit my company for political reasons. Another case, we'll call this one the killer plant case. On a jungle vacation, you find a plant that you think is pretty, but a tour guide tells you that it randomly shoots poisonous barbs to people standing near it that will make you sick and are in fact deadly to about 1% of humans. A friend that's with you rolls their eyes and says, "Yeah, right, if that were real, we'd know about it. They probably just don't want us to take the plants because they're valuable." So you sneak one into your luggage without bothering to look it up and display it in your office. Now, in all these cases, the error hopefully it's clear, isn't merely epistemic, it is that too, but it's moral because the actor knowingly chose to either accept or avoid information that impacts the health of others on weak grounds for personal gain. The sharing of COVID-19 misinformation may seem less severe than these imagined cases, but I submit that the differences are not morally salient. In other words, they reduce to things like proximity to the harmed person or time between the action and the harm or some other morally insignificant thing like that. I think these are good analogies, okay, in the way that analogy needs to be good. This is what's happening more often than not in cases of misinformation spread. It's like an epistemic Goldilocks zone. There is just enough ignorance, culpable ignorance, and just enough potential gain, and the stakes are just low enough, relatively low risk of death from COVID, for example, or the relative unlikelihood of harm for any individual like or share or comment on social media. The stakes are just low enough for an otherwise capable reasoner to convince themselves that accepting and spreading this claim is worth it in this instance. What are the potential gains? Again, they can be psychological benefits, political benefits, emotional benefits like lots of likes and shares, maybe economic benefits. If I get tons of followers through sharing stuff like this on social media, that's pretty easily monetized. Whatever the benefits are, they can be minimal and they only need to be perceived as beneficial. They don't even actually need to be beneficial. They just need to be perceived as beneficial to the person in the moment. So let's wrap up here. Let's ask this broader question: what can universities do about this, if anything? So some quick thoughts about that. First, universities certainly have an important role to play in preventing this problem from persisting through future generations by instilling critical reasoning skills into current and future students. So none of my previous objections to the critical thinking solution negate that value. I do, in fact, still like critical thinking. But this will require a reorganization of course objectives and assessment methods for most universities that, let's just say, administrators and faculty might find cumbersome, okay? Having taught critical thinking and logic to undergraduates, I can say anecdotally that it's a tall order, even when it's the explicit focus of a course. Much more so when it's merely an intended byproduct of some more traditional form of study or a course that focuses on something else. So the reorientation I'm thinking of would also likely require a rethinking of grading itself, since attainment of critical thinking skills and success on objective grading metrics are not always correlated. And of course that change, rethinking grading, would of course involve mollifying lots of parents and careful communication with industry and business leaders about the value of this new kind of degree that we're handing out with no grades. So needless to say, these sorts of changes are unlikely to happen soon, if at all. And because of this, universities are not, I think, presently equipped to stem the tide of misinformation. But it gets worse. Even if such changes were incorporated, so that nearly every college graduate was leaving the university with solid critical thinking skills and the ability to apply them in diverse contexts, we'd still be left with the moral issues I just discussed. Sadly, being good at a thing does not entail that one will choose to do what's right, or even to stay in practice when personal advancement is no longer on the line, as we've seen with case after case of immoral and abusive philosophers, including ethicists, unfortunately. Universities, including private ones in my experience, are rarely in the business of moral formation, whatever their mission statements might say. And indeed, it's unclear how such a project could even be feasible, given the vast disparity of moral views among faculty. For example, the philosophers I know wouldn't even be able to agree if there really are such things as morals, much less what ones are most important and how to teach them. In addition to that, as Nguyen points out, citing Elijah Milgram, quote, "The diversity and specialization of modern scientific knowledge has sharply increased our degree of epistemic vulnerability." In other words, given how niche knowledge has become, even within subfields, to the extent that two academics working on theoretically adjacent projects might have almost no idea what's going on in each other's domain. Given that kind of hyperspecialization, we all depend on each other more than ever for knowing almost anything of any complexity or accuracy about the world. And this effectively carves up human knowledge into a bunch of what he calls cognitive islands, many of which are entirely inaccessible to non-experts, which creates that problem of runaway echo chambers that we mentioned earlier. And the university is both a partial cause of this situation, as it is the hub of specialized research and new knowledge attainment, and it is a necessary part of the solution, because no one outside academia is likely to have the intellectual resources to bridge these gaps or enable the kind of cross-disciplinary communication that will allow for an effective general synthesis of knowledge. So when we zoom out, and I'll end with this, to think about democracy, which is the theme of this conference, it's widely agreed that that form of governance isn't possible without minimally a shared understanding of the basic facts of the world. For better or worse, it is largely the job of university faculty to deliver those facts. So in the end, universities are, I think, somewhat ineffectual at fixing the problem of misinformation and even partially responsible for it. And simultaneously, they're also probably our best hope for preserving democracy. Thank you.
All right. If anybody's still around, that's my talk. We have just a few minutes left, I suppose, for some questions if anybody on here has any.
Hey, Kyle.
Yeah.
This is Amanda. We have a person in-house who has a question. So if you could hang on just 1 second, we're gonna get that over here.
Sure.
So, hi. So you talk a lot about how the universities really should teach critical thinking and things like that. But what would you say about early education and stuff like that? Not only teaching facts like they should be, but also enforcing critical thinking and, you know, teaching children to question sources and question things so that they can so that we can start that process early on in life.
Yeah.
What would you
So I don't know anything about like early childhood education, but I can say I'm strongly in favor of that to the extent that it's feasible. Again, anecdotally, teaching critical thinking to undergraduate students, and critical thinking has a large logic component in it. So there's a certain level of cognitive development that I think is kind of minimally required to get certain aspects of it. And there's a certain level of you gotta have a certain maturity level to engage social issues in a critical way that might not be possible at certain stages of childhood development. I'm not an expert on when that happens, but I'm definitely in favor of introducing the ideas of a kind of healthy suspicion of claims that you encounter, that there are better and worse ways to think about things, and modeling some of those good ways and maybe giving some easier examples of some of the bad ways at a younger age. That would be a question for a child psychologist, when you would start to do that and how simple those examples need to be. But yes, very strongly in favor of that. I think start as soon as we can. I have a 5.5-month-old and I'm already reading him little picture books about philosophy. It's adorable. He's not going to understand that for years, but by the time he's able to, he will have a good model of it already, a lot of background for it already. My main emphasis on critical thinking in this talk, though, is that even if we were to do that successfully, I think that's not necessarily going to solve the problem of misinformation. Which is bleak, and I'm sorry.
Thank you. So the audience here who's live, they're done with questions, and I don't see any questions in the Q&A or the chat. So just a friendly heads up, if any of our online folks have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in there, and either Kyle or I could read them. So we'll just hang on here just for a minute, just to see if anything comes up. If there's anything
Sure.
you want to share. while
Yeah,
we're
I get
waiting.
it. It's late in the day. I will say if anybody comes up with a question and wants to send it to me later, my email is open to you, whitaker@uwgb.edu. Feel free to reach out. I can also make the video of this or the PowerPoint available to anybody that wants it.
So we've got a couple rolling in here. Kyle, do you want me to read them out loud, or do you want to?
Go for it.
Okay, so this one's from Paul, and he says, early child education, how will that go with questioning their parents? Teens, what do they do as well, their job? I think examples of churches, i.e. Catholic, evangelical, is good about a respected source that has many faults.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding this right, how will this go with if you try to encourage children to think critically or to have a kind of healthy suspicion? How's that going to go for their parents? Yeah, well, it could be uncomfortable. and I'm not a parenting expert. I hope to be the kind of parent that welcomes that sort of thing and that models a healthy kind of humility, admitting when I don't know a thing, but also admitting when I do know a thing and what that, the difference looks like. I'm not sure I understand the question about churches. So Paul, if you want to clarify that in the chat, I'm happy to think more about it. Being a religious person myself who has taught at a Catholic university, a Lutheran university, now a secular university, there are lots of different ways that misinformation functions within those spaces that I'm happy to say more about if you want to clarify your question there.
Just another one from the audience. Caitlin asks, do you think there's an effective way to solve this problem?
So I assume you mean the problem of misinformation in general, what I call the misinformation problem. If there is, I don't know what it is. And this is the most depressing part of the talk. It's too big. There are too many urgent issues affected by it, issues that if we don't do something now will become unmanageable. Climate change is probably the best example of that. COVID-19 is a great example of that. We didn't do anything and it became unmanageable, and hundreds of thousands of people died. Tens of thousands of them at least died needlessly, which is to say without the influence of misinformation, almost certainly would not have died. So yeah, I wish I had an answer for you. The best answer I've seen for how to actually help comes back to one-on-one relationships, friendships, earning the trust of someone in one of these situations, which drives that wedge into their worldview and demonstrates to them that, well, if my authority could have been wrong about this, what else might they have been wrong about? And that creates a kind of cascade effect. And it's very traumatizing in many cases, but eventually that person is able to become less susceptible to this echo chambered influence. Someone else I see asked about cults. This is how this works in cults. If you look into research about cult deprogramming, that's almost always what happens. And the worry that I raise in the talk about that is that it's not scalable. That if we're dependent on that, that's a fearful place to be. It's beautiful and good when it happens, but speaking at a society-wide level, a system-wide level, that's pretty terrifying if that's our best effort. I think there is some interesting work being done in psychology and in some of it in sociology and some other fields too, political science, about how we might actually begin to use some of the tools of misinformation against itself, learn what works and then try to model it, but in a healthier way. There might be some potential for some of that, but it's relatively recent research that I'm aware of. We exist in this polarized, echo chambered context, and piecemeal plucking people out of it is not going to solve the problem. We're going to have to figure out a way to work within it if we're going to do anything about these large scale problems facing our societies.
Well, it brings us right to our time here today. So Is there anything else you want to say as we wrap up?
Just thanks for coming. If there was something in the chat that I didn't get to, I'll stick around and type a reply if that's okay.
That sounds great. We can keep it up here.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone.